Hey, middle school family, welcome back. Today we're going to continue learning about World War I, and today we're going to talk about life in the trenches or trench warfare, which is a type of military strategy that was employed during World War I. So I hope you're ready for some blood and guts and some down and dirty pictures and information. So let's get into it. We're going to get right into the trenches together. You might have heard people talk about that before or use that term and say, we're in the trenches together. Well, by the end of this lesson today, I hope you'll have a better understanding of what that means and where that phrase comes from. So let's do a quick review. What was the spark that started World War I? What was the spark we learned about yesterday that really kind of ignited the war? That's right. In 1914, Archduke Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary and his wife were assassinated by Serbian terrorists. Remember his name? Gavrilo Princip. And we watched a video yesterday about the Black Hand, which was the group that he was a part of, and the assassination that they planned together. Very good. So here we are at the start of World War I, and the year is 1914, and countries in Europe are pretty peaceful. They've enjoyed about 100 years or so of peace with one another, and many people were hoping for, a permanent end to war. Some Europeans believed that they had made enough progress that war was a thing of the past, wasn't anything they had to worry about anymore. But within 10 years, a massive war is going to engulf Europe, and it's going to spread across the globe to countries outside of Europe. While peace and harmony characterized much of Europe at the beginning of the 1900s, there were less visible and darker forces at work as well. Just below the surface of peace and goodwill, Europe witnessed several gradual developments that would ultimately help propel the continent into war. Austria-Hungary's declaration of war against Serbia set off a chain reaction within the alliance system. The countries of Europe followed through on their pledges to support one another. Remember yesterday we talked about alliances? And so when the spark was ignited, when Archduke Ferdinand was executed, and one country after another kind of dogpiled in on the war because they had all of these alliances that were already set up ahead of time. And so everybody had to kind of jump in this fight and participate. As a result, nearly all of Europe joined what would be the largest, most destructive war that the world had yet seen. By mid-August 1914, the battle lines were clearly drawn. On one side were Germany and Austria-Hungary. They were known as the Central Powers. If you look at the map on your screen, you can see where they're located. This is why they're called the Central Powers, because their location was in the heart of Europe. Bulgaria and the Ottoman Empire, you're going to learn a lot about the Ottoman Empire next year in 8th grade in world history, and 8th grade you learned about the Ottoman Empire last year in world history. So Bulgaria and the Ottoman Empire would later join the Central Powers in hopes of regaining lost territories. Spoiler alert, it doesn't work out good for the Ottoman Empire. On the other side were Great Britain, France, and Russia. Together, they were known as the Allied Powers, or the Allies. Japan joined the Allies within weeks, and Italy joined later. Italy had been a member of the Triple Alliance with Germany and Austria-Hungary. However, the Italians joined the other side after accusing their former partners of unjustly starting the war. So Italy actually starts off on one side and then flip-flops to the other side. Food, ammunition, fresh troops, mail, and orders were delivered through the trenches, which contained command posts, first aid stations, kitchens, and latrines. What are latrines? Toilets. Each trench in World War I was dug in a zigzag so that no enemy could fire for more than a few yards down its length. Here we have a picture of Alfred von Schlieffen. Okay, so look at the map and see where Germany is. So Germany is in part of the Central Powers. So there it is in the middle of Europe, kind of in the heart, in the center, which is why they were called the Central Powers. So here's Germany, and they're facing a war on two fronts. When we talk about the front, we're really talking about the battle lines. So here, when you see the border between Germany and France, that is what we call the Western Front, because it's on the western side of the Central Powers. And over here where you see Germany meets Poland, that is the Eastern Front. So Germany is facing a war on both fronts. So they had to develop a battle strategy, because how are they going to fight, enemies on both sides? This battle strategy was known as the Schlieffen Plan, and it was named after its designer, the strapping young man you see before you on the screen, General Alfred Graf von Schlieffen. The plan called for attacking and defeating France in the west. So that first they're going to attack France on the Western Front, and then they're going to rush east to fight Russia. The Germans felt they could carry out such a plan because Russia lagged behind the rest of Europe in its railroad system, and thus it would take longer to supply its front lines. So because Russia doesn't have a strong railroad system, they felt that they wouldn't be able to get supplies and troops quickly to the border on the Eastern Front. Nonetheless, speed was vital to the Schlieffen Plan. German leaders knew they needed to win a quick victory over France. Early on, it appeared that Germany would do just that. By early September, German forces had swept into France and reached the outskirts of Paris. A major German victory appeared just days away. So here they are in the beginning of September, and here they're in France, and they've just reached Paris, and it looks like they're days away from winning the war. On September 5th, however, the Allies regrouped and attacked the Germans northeast of Paris, in the valley of the Marne River. Every single soldier was hurled into the struggle. They needed reinforcements, and they had to figure out how to get the Allied soldiers quickly to the battle with Germany that was taking place in Paris, France. And you know how they did that? They mobilized 600 taxi cabs. 600 taxis. They shoved them full of soldiers, and they rushed them to the battle lines, to the front where the war is taking place. We call that the front. After 4 days of fighting, the German generals gave the order to retreat. So that battle line there between France and Germany, that's called the Western Front. And if you look at the map, you can see where that is located. As the summer of 1914 turned to fall, the war turned into a long and bloody stalemate. Have you ever heard the term stalemate before? That means you're in a deadlock in which neither side is able to defeat the other. So here we are in a stalemate along the battlefields of France. This deadlocked region in northern France became known as the Western Front. Both sides then dug in for the winter. They did not know that the conflict would turn into a long, deadly stalemate, a deadlock in which neither side is able to defeat the other. Battle lines in France would remain almost unchanged for 4 years. Can you imagine a stalemate going on that long? For 4 years, you're just fighting and fighting and fighting and not really making any true progress. Trench warfare soon became a war of attrition. A war of attrition really is a military strategy where one side attempts to win a war by wearing down the enemy to the point of collapse through continuous losses of personnel, that means soldiers, and material like ammunition, guns, artillery. The war is usually won by the side that has the most resources. So by early 1915, opposing armies on the Western Front had dug miles of parallel trenches to protect themselves from enemy fire. This set the stage for what became known as trench warfare. In this type of warfare, soldiers fought each other from trenches, and armies traded huge losses of human life for pitifully small land gains. That means each side is kind of pushing against each other and trying to, make progress and push miles to the west, and the Allied forces in France, they're trying to push miles to the east, but really they're only moving back and forth a couple feet. And even if you move ahead a couple feet, the next week you probably get pushed back the same couple feet. And the whole time, so many people were dying. Life in the trenches was pure misery. The men slept in mud. They washed in mud. They ate mud. And they dreamed mud. The trenches swarmed with rats. Fresh food was non-existent. The trenches are swarmed with rats, and there's hardly any fresh food. I wonder what the soldiers had to eat. Sleep was nearly impossible. The space between the opposing trenches won the grim name No Man's Land. So you've got the Allied forces trenches on the west, and you've got the Central Powers trenches to the east, and the grassy field between them where they would shoot at each other, that was called No Man's Land. When the officers ordered an attack, their men went over the top of their trenches into this bombed out landscape. There, they usually met murderous rounds of machine gun fire. Staying put, however, did not ensure one's safety either. Artillery fire brought death right into the trenches. The Western Front had become a terrain of death. It stretched almost 500 miles from the North Sea to the Swiss border.
On the Western Front, the German assault had finally failed, and soldiers on both sides had raced to dig an elaborate trench system that stretched for 300 miles, from the English Channel all the way to Switzerland. On New Year's Day in 1915, the young men who had gone off to fight glorious battles were now trapped in a desperate war of attrition.
Someone said to us, excitedly, "Jack Smith." I said, "What about him?" "He's dead, he's been shot." The first one of the battalion to be shot. I said, "What?" "Yes, he's dead, he's been shot. He put his head too far over and a sniper got him." And that caused a bit of a sensation amongst the lads. They thought, well, this is not exactly what we come for kind of business. But later on, from that day onwards, when we went to the trenches, it was 3 killed, 4 killed, 5 killed, 20 killed, 100 killed. By then, we was veterans.
A young American poet, Alan Seeger, was among those looking for adventure when he joined the Foreign Legion to fight for France. His diary reveals how seldom he found it.
It's a miserable life, shivering in these wretched holes in the dirt. We're not leading the life of men at all, but that of animals, living in our holes in the ground, and only showing our heads outside to fight and to feed.
When we'd been there about 6 months, covered in mud, wet through practically all day, absolutely chewed up my lice, we used to say, and to think we wanted to come to this hole. I said, yes, we didn't know.
Every so often, one side or the other seized a few hundred yards of territory only to be forced back again, surrendering what had cost hundreds of lives to win. The front never moved more than a mile or two in either direction. By the spring of 1915, the generals had concluded that the best way out of the stalemate was to blast the enemy out of their trenches. The same factories and assembly lines that had begun to contribute to life in the 20th century were now retooled to create massive killing machines. This was the industrialization of war.
There was just the splintered trunks of trees, and there was the quagmire of the shell holes, and no grass. It was just like a lunar landscape, really.
At night, the rats, they grew to enormous sizes, feeding on the corpses there. It was impossible to get the dead buried.
We put dead bodies in the bottom of the trench so that we could stand on them to keep dry. And on some occasion, dead bodies was put on the top of the trench to make it higher, so that we could walk a bit better instead of crouching.
And contributing to the stalemate were new weapons. By now, the machine gun had been perfected to the point that a single soldier could command as much firepower as 40 riflemen. The tank made its first appearance, invented by the British to get through the dense thickets of barbed wire that protected the enemy trenches. And in April 1915, the Germans introduced the most terrifying weapon of all, poison gas.
No one had ever seen it before. This is the moment when chemical warfare was invented. It scared the living daylights out of the Canadian troops that were hit by it.
The First World War had become a contest not of fighting spirit, but of technological might. And for the soldiers caught in the middle of it, there was no way forward and no way back. There was simply endurance.
You saw a little bush, and you swore that bush was somebody creeping up on you. The perfect soldier then in that war would have been somebody with no imagination whatsoever. We all had too much imagination.
So many men who had been through these dangers and anxieties, their nerve broke and they were the victims of shell shock, you know. There is a breaking point for most people, for everybody really. Robbed of all humanity and courage and everything else that makes life worth living, really. He's descended to something less than human.
So you can see where we get a lot of terms that you may have heard of before, but didn't quite know what they meant or where they came from. So, for example, when we talk about the term shell-shocked, that term comes from the young men who would come back from the war, and they would be so affected from the horrors that they had been through that they may have had severe psychological damage from that. So when you hear people talk about someone being shell-shocked, that's where that comes from, you know, the artillery shells. The term or the phrase "in the trenches," you know, we say, oh man, we were in the trenches together. That comes from this trench warfare from World War I. So a lot of the terms and phrases that you hear, they come from historical events. Modern weapons added greatly to the destructiveness of the war. Rapid-fire machine guns mowed down waves of soldiers, making it nearly impossible to advance across no man's land. Artillery allowed troops to shell enemy lines and cities from more than 10 miles away. Look at the picture. You can see one of the first tanks that was invented. And the tank was actually invented in Britain in 1916. It was an armored tank, and it was mounted with machine guns. These tanks were designed to move across broken ground and through barbed wire. Still, the first tanks moved slowly, and they broke down often. They did little to break the stalemate. So even though they were new, and even though they had weapons on the front, and even though they could go through barbed wire, they moved really slow, so opposing soldiers had time to get out of the way, and they also broke down a lot, which was inconvenient. In 1915, Germany began using poison gas that blinded or choked its victims or caused agonizing burns and blisters. Later that year, the Allies also began to use gas. Though soldiers were eventually given gas masks, poison gas remained one of the most dreaded hazards of war. Although poison gas could be fatal, it was an uncertain weapon. It was hard to control because, I mean, think about it. You don't know which way the wind is going to blow, and sometimes shifting wind might blow the gas back on the side that launched it. Poison gas was a horrific weapon of war, and many soldiers were blinded permanently from it. Both sides also used aircraft. At first, planes simply observed enemy troop movements. So at first, both sides used aircraft just to kind of fly over the trenches of the other side to see what they were doing and what they had planned and what their stockpiles looked like. In 1915, Germany used Zeppelins, which were large gas-filled balloons, to bomb the English coast. Later, both sides equipped airplanes with machine guns. Pilots were known as flying aces, and they battled in the sky. And these fights were called dog fights. So the flying aces, which if you've ever seen Charlie Brown, I can't remember if it's Charlie Brown, Great Pumpkin Charlie Brown or Charlie Brown Thanksgiving, but Snoopy is a World War I flying ace, and he's on top of his doghouse. So that's where they got that from, is from World War I. The soldiers would fly around in airplanes with machine guns and shoot at each other, and they were called flying aces, and these were called dog fights. And they were spectacular and amazing and incredible to watch, but they also had little effect on the war. Submarines proved to be much more important, however. German submarines roamed the Atlantic. The submarine's primary weapon against ships was the torpedo, or the underwater missile. These U-boats did tremendous damage to the Allied side, sinking merchant ships that carried vital supplies to Britain. To counteract submarine warfare, the Allies organized convoys, or groups of merchant ships protected by warships. Germany's policy of unrestricted submarine warfare would eventually help bring the United States into the war. So we're going to learn about that, how Germany's use of the submarine, and they end up doing something that's going to bring the United States into the war. And so we're going to step in and we're going to become part of this war soon. Okay, so here we are. We're at the beginning of World War I. Please use this video to help you complete the 2 worksheets that are due for today on trench warfare, and then make sure you upload those onto Google Classroom. I love you, and I hope you have a wonderful Wednesday.